Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in this video, we're going to be a little bit dangerous. We are going to cover Marvel 1602, or at least part 1. Marvel 1602 is one of these really interesting stories because it was written by Neil Gaiman, but it's not like Sandman. It's starkly different. It's amazing, but it's different in a lot of different ways, right? So, and we'll find out how different it is, right? So what this does is this initially picks up basically with Queen Elizabeth, right? Having a meeting with her guy, Sir Nicholas Fury. Now, the cool thing about this is that Nick Fury is one of these characters in comics and Marvel Comics where his role just never really changes. He's always the same guy, right? Like old school white guy Nick Fury was always the same guy. He was mysterious, he was duplicitous, but he was basically the intelligence guy. He knew everything that was going on before everybody else did. But nonetheless, what you have here is you have basically Nicholas Fury meeting with the Queen and dumping a bit of information, and then in turn, we end up having Stephen Strange who joins in. Now, Stephen Strange showing up here is not the traditional master of the mystic arts that we would expect, right? That's not really what this is. Stephen Strange is more akin to an alchemist. He's the guy that's basically running up on the Queen who's sick and feeding her like some kind of soup composed of like some weird plant somewhere and barley. That's basically what he is. That's more or less what this guy is. Now with Doctor Strange showing up here, he's basically told by the Queen, tell Nicholas Fury what you've heard. And what Doctor Strange seems to reveal here is there's some kind of a plot or some kind of scenario brewing based out of Jerusalem, and they don't really know exactly what it is that's going on. Whatever this particular object or artifact is, if it fell into the wrong hands, it could be the undoing of England, right? It could bring everything crashing down. And that's really where this story gets kind of interesting because it all basically takes place in England itself. And so what it does, we end up having Stephen Strange and Nick Fury who kind of go out and have a bit of a conversation. We end up switching to basically this high tower, the Palace of Inquisition in Spain. And we basically have this guy who's all chained up. And what he talks about is how individuals had been burned at the stake. He's heard it happen, different things like that. And he's not really being allowed to be killed, right? He doesn't really even know why he's here in the first place. All this guy knows is that he's basically just been chained up here, and then they've come and asked him questions occasionally, but they ask him more like a friend, right? So it's not like they're using hot pokers, or they're using like an Iron Maiden or anything like that to get information out of this guy. Instead, it's just kind of like, I know why they have me here, but they haven't really given any indication of what they want. And what we end up finding out is this is Warren Worthington. This is Angel. And he's here, of course, with his angel's wings. And so the indication is that somewhere along the line, somebody found out who he was, and then he's been brought here to the Inquisition. Now, the other sad thing about this is he kind of makes this comment, right? The next time he sees the sky, he can't fly, because he's chained up. The next time he sees the sky, it'll be when he's ashes, and his ashes are basically kind of going off into the air. And it's a sad thing to hear. It's a sad thing to see. But what it does here is it basically switches over to a couple things going on, right? So we basically pick up in a place called the Moor's Head, which is a tavern in Westminster, and you've got a bard there, a guy basically playing music, and then you've got this kid who's sitting at the bar and kind of messing around with a spider. Now, the bard himself, as he goes through and he starts playing songs for people about the Fantastic Four, which are really kind of given to us, or the indication is that they were basically explorers, in the sense that they boarded a vessel and then went off into wherever the world might take them, never to return. So the large assumption seems to be that they're dead. It's very superstitious, which is how it was back then. But we end up, of course, finding out that this young kid is named Peter. Now, we of course know this is essentially the stand-in for Peter Parker, but he's taken by Nick Fury and then basically brought to kind of, have a conversation of sorts, right? He's more or less his young tutor. And this bard, where he's kind of dismissed and he really seems to be somewhat goofy, somewhat silly, we end up finding out this bard is basically Daredevil. And so showing up here in this dark room, as we know, Matt Murdock cannot actually see, right? He uses his other senses, which have been enhanced as a result of his loss of vision in order to compensate. And so what this does is where Matt Murdock shows up and is like, who in the heck is this kid? Basically, Nick Fury's like, this kid is essentially my new assistant. Anything you're going to say in front of me, you can say in front of him. Seemingly, he's being groomed to replace Nick Fury as part of the intelligence arm of England. And so what Matt Murdock basically says is, Stephen Strange was right. There's word that there's something coming out of the Jerusalem, right? And it's coming this way. That almost all the kingdoms out there, right? Like the Spanish and the Russians, the whole 9 yards, they want this, right? Count Von Doom and Latveria, they want this artifact. What this artifact is, I don't know, but they want it. And so the response to Nick Fury is, then you've got 10 days to get to Jerusalem and find out what this is, and then in turn, report back to me. And so after receiving payment in the form of a diamond, we in turn basically switch over to Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange, of course, is basically kind of going through one of his trances, more or less. Again, he's kind of invoking the mystic arts to a degree, but it's nowhere near grand in scale. Instead, it almost kind of seems seems supernatural in terms of how it works. But what he does is he gets these visions, right? He basically starts saying a series of things, and Clea's job is to basically report on what it is that Stephen Strange is saying, because he doesn't know what he's saying, right? He's in a trance, he's seeing things and then repeating them back, and he may not remember them, exactly as he saw them, right? So she's there as kind of like a sort of backup, right? And so what this does is it basically shows that there is a ship called the Virginia Maid, and it basically, seems to belong to a young girl along with what looks like a Native American. He's pale, never seen a Native American that pale before. But it's a Native American, and then of course he also transitions to Warren Worthington, or to Angel, inside the tower. The Stephen Strange can actually see the various ghosts of people who have been burned at the stake. Like, he ends up transitioning to the Inquisition Tower in Spain, and then you of course have a woman who's clothed in red along with an old guy, and this woman can see Stephen Strange right? She becomes aware of him and then banishes him away. Given the color, it largely seems to be Wanda Maximoff, but basically Stephen kind of gets these glimpses of things that are going on in the world at the moment, none of which really seem to provide any real insight into what it is that's actually going on with regards to this artifact or this item coming out of Jerusalem. And so from there, we actually switch over to the Inquisition, and we basically pick up with a guy who, by all standards of measurement, seems to be Magneto, accompanied by Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. And it's kind of one of these things where they're essentially working on the idea of bringing King James into power, right? King James of Scotland. And the reason why this matters is because what it does is it seems to allow the Inquisitor to be positioned in a place where he can have a level of power much higher than what he is right now. So he's just literally trying to move above his station, but he also seems to kind of have a vendetta against witch breeds, which if you guys are reading Excalibur at the moment, you know exactly what that means. It's basically just mutants. And they're referred to as witch breeds here because they just seem to be people who are invoking witchcraft, right? That's kind of the explanation there. And so what happens is Quicksilver is basically tasked by the Inquisitor, by Magneto more or less, to basically run to King James and essentially say, we understand that you're trying to access position or trying to take over England once the Queen dies. We will make that happen for you. We will basically have the entire kingdom of England begging for the death of witch breeds, and we'll blame every single problem on them. But what we do here is we switch over to the Virginia Maid, and we basically got a guy named Rojas along with this young girl. And now Virginia is the actual name, right? So it's just named after the little girl. And we're not really given a whole lot of information here outside of the fact that there are essentially people who are leaving a particular location, leaving Roanoke basically, and showing up here. Now the reason why this matters is because in real world history, in 1580, the Roanoke colonists had just kind of vanished. I'm not going to swear to the exact date, but the idea behind Roanoke is that at one point, basically individuals left Roanoke to travel to England and then come back, and that the entire Roanoke colony had seemingly disappeared, right? Nobody really knew where anybody in Roanoke went. Now, as time progressed, and I don't remember exactly the exact history of it, but they referred to what were known as like blue-eyed Native Americans, and so it seemed that they were basically either inducted into the local Native American tribes or just outright massacred. It's not super important here, just to kind of give you a little bit of context. The whole Roanoke incident didn't happen, right? That does not seem to have been the case. And essentially, like, this girl was basically sent away along with Rojas, or at least sent here for a particular purpose. Although again, we don't know exactly what that purpose is. And so what we end up doing here is getting a little bit of information, a little bit of factual explanation of what's going on, insofar as you have Peter, who basically starts talking to Nick Fury, asking some questions. And Nick Fury says that a lot of this really seems to stem from Templars. Nick Fury basically kind of explains that at some point along the line, you had Templars who were operating as essentially guards of a great treasure, and that within a century, they were the most powerful force seemingly throughout the entirety of Europe. Now, after a while, the Pope and the King at the time basically came together in order to bring down the Templars, right? The King of France and the Pope came together to essentially rid their forces. And for the most part, the Templars just scattered, right? Like, there were some who stayed in Jerusalem in order to basically just stay hidden, right? They believed that it was easier to hide in plain sight. There were some who fled the entirety of Jerusalem and just took off to various locations, some of which were known and some of which were unknown. But no matter what the history dictates, what we know is that this secret has been well kept, right? Nobody knows what this treasure is. Nobody knows what this artifact is, but seemingly everybody wants to get their hand on it. And it seems to quietly be moved from one location to the next to ensure that nobody discovers this location, and that if they happen to, nobody can actually get their hands on it. And so the other reason why Nick Fury had brought Peter to this location is because Nick Fury's spies had basically told him there's people coming out for you to kill you. And so of course you basically have what looks like Vulture flying down out of nowhere and then attacking Nick Fury, trying to assassinate him, who's protected with leather and chainmail. And then in turn, like, this Vulture guy is basically taken prisoner, and that's basically it. And so from there, we switch over to Angel preparing to be burned at the stake. And for the most part, he seems to have made peace with this, right? He seems to have made peace with his death. And what it does is it basically allows him to just kind of understand that, hey, this is just the way things go. Like, it sucks that I'm going to be burned alive here, right? I mean, he's not happy about it. Like, yeah, man, everybody's got to go sometime. That's not really the stance. But fortunately for him, he's saved because there are people here who are watching the whole thing unfold. One of them uses their powers to freeze the torch itself. The other one basically destroys the bonds for Angel, only for us to learn this is Iceman and Cyclops. They literally free this guy, attack the guards, right? Like Bobby Drake puts up all this ice in order to block everybody from getting in there. Cyclops blows a hole in the wall and then they bail, right? They're just immediately out. They take off out of that place and that's essentially it. And so from here you switch over to Angel, basically on this ship, you know, with Cyclops and so on. But essentially the question's asked, what am I doing here? What's the whole idea behind this? And the response of Cyclops and everybody is, we have a safe haven, right? We have a place that we refer to as the schoolhouse, right? We also call it a sanctuary, but it's a place where those like us can travel to in order to learn how to use our powers and in order to be safe, right? It's basically the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters is really all it is. Now, the funny thing about this, and this was actually a genius move by Neil Gaiman to kind of throw things off or to make them seem a little more interesting, is that John Gray is not actually John Gray. Because when I originally read this, I was like, John Gray, like that's the father of Jean, right? Like, why is he so young? And in reality, it is Jean, right? Just kind of masquerading as a guy by the name of John. And so what this does is it switches over actually to the Xavier School itself, right? Nick Fury basically showing up here. And when he arrives, of course, he's met by Beast. But it's one of these things where he kind of muses about the idea that despite the way he looked, that he always had this sort of high level of intelligence and that nobody ever really gave him a shot to really see what his intelligence was. But back then, during that sort of primitive time, nobody really cared, right? It was just how you looked. And then from there, they would decide whether or not you were worth anything, right? So it was kind of bonkers, you know, in terms of how that goes down. But with Beast bringing out Charles Xavier, you of course have Nick Fury who basically fires up a pipe with weed, right? Because like literally Professor Xavier is like a noxious weed, Nicholas, put it out. It fouls the air and blackens the lungs. And it's like, so basically Nick Fury's smoking weed, right? That's really what seemed to be going on. But when Xavier comes out and the two of them start talking, Nick Fury basically starts saying, look, there's an important thing that you have to be aware of here. The Inquisition is on your trail. Like, despite the fact that they might hate King James, they hate you more. And they're basically looking for any means to get rid of you, right? So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it's essentially saying like the fact that you guys basically broke out Angel the way that you did makes them hate you even more. And so now all you've done is engender more and more hatred against you. Now, it's not like Nick Fury's approaching this from the perspective of like, you really shouldn't have done that. You know, it's like you did what you had to do, right? You did what you thought was the right call. You know, just know that yes, there are consequences for these kinds of things, you know? And so basically Xavier starts to realize their time of safety is coming to an end. There's only so much they can do. And Xavier more or less seemed to see this coming. And so what he did is he essentially kind of created the X-Men more or less. And it is the original roster, right? Angel and Cyclops, Beast, Iceman, and Jean Grey, of course, in this Marvel 1602 era. But that was the whole idea from it, right? To basically create a kind of safeguard to ensure the protection of themselves and various other, you know, mutants out there who may be sought after by the Inquisition. From here, what it does is it sort of breaks away from that for a second. And it really kind of has Xavier almost kind of adopt this, not really a militant attitude, but to basically say, this has been assembled for the purpose of protection, right? We don't go out seeking fights, but we can protect ourselves. And if what the Grand Inquisition is looking for is to pick a fight, well, then they pick the right place because we'll give them all the fight they can handle. It's one of these things where he's just not naive is really what it comes down to. And so jumping over to London with the arrival of the Virginia Maid, with Rojas and with Virginia herself, you basically have, you know, Peter who kind of appears out of nowhere and it's like, hey, he basically tries to knock on the door or tries to reach for the door. Rojas basically like grabs his hand, you know, and that's when Virginia responds and it's kind of like, hey, like let him go. Let's find out what it is that he has to say. And in a lot of ways, Rojas is just this super protective bodyguard. And so Peter essentially says, look, the queen, you know, we'll see you now, right? Like she summons your presence, right? She's here to see whatever it is that you have to talk about or anything along those lines. And Rojas is kind of like, okay, then I'm coming. The other part of this is that when we jump over to Daredevil, that of course he comes across Black Widow. The Black Widow and he seem to have a kind of relationship or some sort of history together. And it's one of these things where it's like, look, I get you're here on behalf of Nick Fury. The carriage is here. It'll take you to where you need to go. But we also get this sort of origin for Daredevil. You know, with the origin that we get, you know, where Black Widow asked the question, how was it that you lost your eyesight? All we really get here is that Matt Murdock himself himself was just a curious child, right? And he almost kind of attributes it to God and says like it was the choice of God or something like that, right? You know, it was an act of him. But whatever it was, that Matt Murdock was always kind of curious, right? And so he ended up kind of down in this cave and saw this sort of green ooze, right? And when he went to go basically touch it, and then, you know, he seemed to put it in his mouth, it basically infected his body and left him blind. Now, why you're going to put a green ooze into your mouth, I don't really know, but nonetheless, this basically left him completely and totally blind, right? And he's been that way ever since. And so where his mom tried to teach him as best she could, where he had a lot of tutors to try to help him, you know, kind of recover from his blindness or at least navigate, as time progressed, he became exceedingly capable in what it was that his function was, right? To basically serve a goal to function within the world itself, but then also basically came to work for Nick Fury. And so what you get here are a lot of fast-tracked events happening at the same time. And that's kind of that's the craziest thing about 1602, right? Like you'll get like a whole plethora of what's going on in like one particular part of the world on one page. And then like in the next page, it'll be a whole plethora. There's so much dialogue and so much that happens in this story. It's kind of nuts. So you basically end up picking up with Victor Von Doom, right? Just kind of musing at the idea that he's seeking after this treasure as well, whatever this treasure happens to be for Jerusalem. You've got Doctor Strange, who after seeing all these various, you know, incidents and these various scenarios, decides to go to the palace. He doesn't know why, but he feels like he should. All this is kind of converging into a particular location, right? Everything's kind of coming together all at one time. And not only that, after you had Pietro, you know, Quicksilver meeting with the King of Scotland, King James is welcome to the idea of the Inquisition basically helping him get a foothold in England after the fall of the Queen of England, so he can essentially seize power of this place. And so where of course he ends up coming back, explaining everything to Magneto more or less. The question of Wanda is, why is it that if we have powers and we have these abilities that, you know, we don't know that they're not a gift from God, right? Why do we assume that the devil's work? And the response of Magneto is, because I'm the Grand Inquisitor. And I say that it is, right? Like that's the case. And again, that's how things were. Nobody really knew exactly what was going on, right? There's no definitive answers that it's God's work. They just assume that it is, right? They assume their own righteousness because they fight on behalf of God. Therefore, everything they do is inherently righteous because they're like, God is inherently righteous. I am a servant of God. Therefore, everything I do is righteous. That was the kind of argument that you saw created back then. And so because of that, what we end up having, of course, is the kind of coming together of the X-Men, the traditional X-Men team, Xavier actually calling on Nick Fury and saying, hey, we're also going to need your help here, right? Like we're going to need you on our side. And Nick Fury actually takes out a picture and shows it to Xavier and is like, I need to know where this guy came from or who he's serving, whoever this assassin was that tries to kill me. And Xavier's response is, I don't know, right? This guy's mind is clouded with anger over the fact that he failed to kill you. It's the only thing that fills his mind, the only thought he has. That's all he wants to do, right? There's also like two other of these assassins out there. One is designed to assassinate this young girl who came there, and the third one is to take out the queen. All of this really seems to be based on the idea of taking out the queen and then seemingly securing the role of King James in England itself, right? And so from here we jump to the kingdom of the queen, or the court of the queen, and this is when we kind of start to get a few answers, but then things suddenly go awry, right? The most likely question is, why is this girl here in the first place? Now, she arrives here and basically says, like, my father brings you this map of the colony of Roanoke to show you what we've built, to show you what we've done, that your money has not been in vain, right? We didn't just take it and run. We're actually doing stuff, making moves, right? We got some things going on. But when she also asked the question about Rojas, this is when we start to get an actual answer here, that yes, most Native Americans have black hair. And it's even a little bit racist in the sense of like red skin. But the response of Virginia is yes, but this guy's different, right? And my father says this is proof that the Welsh must have visited the New World long before the Spanish, but there's very little of them left behind, right? So it seems like Rojas is the only basically white, blonde-haired Native American that's out there. And so it's kind of interesting because the queen invites him to dance for a second, and the response of Rojas is, no, I exist to protect this girl. I exist to protect Virginia. I don't engage in those kinds of things. And so when we get to the moment we would normally get an explanation of what's actually happening here, then suddenly this assassin jumps in and basically ends up grabbing Virginia and then flying away. Now Rojas responds by grabbing a shield and throwing it at the guy, and then in turn, as soon as this guy basically starts to make it up, suddenly Virginia vanishes, right? She's nowhere to be seen. This guy comes crashing back down. He's got a massive scratch on his face, and when the question is, where in the heck is Virginia, we end up seeing Virginia on top of this tower more or less, and she's a hawk. Virginia looks like she has the ability to transform into animals. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.